Hi everyone, and welcome to this virtual ICML 2020 tutorial on representation learning without labels. My name is Ali Islami, and I will be presenting alongside Irina Higgins and Danilo Rosende. I'd also like to acknowledge Mihaela, Shakir, Alex, Olivier, Brian, Stephen, and David for their help in preparing these slides. The agenda for this tutorial is that we'll be doing it in 4 parts, each part roughly 30 minutes long each, and we'll have 15-minute Q&A sessions after each part. I'll do the introduction and the second part, building blocks, which will be providing a very high-level motivation and overview of modern techniques. In the third part, we'll go a bit deeper and look at the landscape of methods, comparing them along various important axes. And in the fourth part, we'll zoom back out and provide an outlook for the field. It's important, I think, to be clear about what the tutorial is. The tutorial, as I said, will be an overview of building blocks. It will be a comparison of methods, but we're going to focus on the image modality for lack of time. And what the tutorial isn't is a comprehensive list of all relevant techniques. We just think it wouldn't be possible to do that in 2 hours. And also, we're not going to focus much on representation learning for other modalities other than images. So we're not going to talk about text or audio or video or graphs and so on. I also want to provide several disclaimers. The first is that this is a huge topic with a vast multidisciplinary history. And so inevitably, we will miss important related work. It just wouldn't be possible to do the whole field justice in the amount of time we have available. Each citation that we provide is only meant as a representative example of a particular idea. And we really recommend you use those examples as seeds for websites like connectedpapers.com that show you all of the relevant literature surrounding a paper. Also, there are many views and perspectives on the literature in this field, and we're only going to be providing one of those views. And therefore, we will inevitably oversample some works and undersample other works. Also, it's important to say that the presentation is not necessarily chronological, meaning that if a paper is shown first in the slides, it doesn't mean it was discovered in that order. Finally, if you have any pointers or suggestions, please email us or contact us on Twitter. We will make the slides available after the presentation, and we'll do our best to keep them in the best state possible. So if you have any feedback, let us know. And you'll see in the top right-hand side of the corner of the slides, these yellow boxes. That's where we'll be putting the citations. So please pay attention to those boxes and follow up where necessary. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so let's just jump right in. I'd like to start by talking about a philosopher you might have heard of before, Plato. He lived about 2,400 years ago. He's often depicted in pictures with his finger pointing at the sky. And the reason for this is that, as opposed to Aristotle, he believed in a philosophy of forms or ideas, which was that there are certain truths that are outside the realm of reality. And he used the allegory of the cave to describe this philosophy. And this allegory, I think, is actually insightful for the kinds of problems we're trying to solve in artificial intelligence. So let's go through it. What Plato believed was that our condition as human beings was that of a bound observer placed in the bottom of a cave. And this observer has a wall behind them where there are some true objects placed on that wall. Now, the observer can't directly look at the objects because of the way in which they are bound, but what they can see instead are shadows projected on the wall in front of them by those objects due to the firelight behind those objects. So in this allegory, the observer only sees these impoverished shadows, these impoverished projections of those true objects. And what they're trying to do is to figure out what these objects are, what their nature is, how they behave, and so on. And in Plato's allegory, what he's trying to make clear is the fact that as an observer of the reality around us, we never have full observability. We're always viewing an impoverished projection of that reality. And anyone who's done computer vision is very familiar with this fact. So more precisely, in this allegory, we have the true object that creates an image through the image formation process. And that image is observed by the bound observer, who then forms a representation for the object that they think they're looking at via the image. And of course, the objective is to form representations that are meaningful and close to the truth. And again, it's important to note that the observer never has direct access to the true object. It's only through these projections. So for instance, if the object we're looking at is a vase, we want the image to invoke in the observer's mind the idea of a vase, or the representation of a vase. Now, of course, it turns out to be a little bit more complicated than this, because this object isn't just its class, but it has other attributes. It has a shape, and that shape, for instance, could be represented either by its name or by, a mesh, perhaps, or a voxel grid or a point set. Of course, it has a color, it has height, weight, it has properties like whether it's scratched or if it's broken or not. It might be moving or not. And there's many other attributes that this observer might be trying to reason about when viewing this object through the shadow. So as I said, which attributes will the observer focus on? What formats will the observer represent each attribute in? For instance, height, is it going to be in centimeters or in inches? Color, is it going to be a string or is it going to be RGB values? Shape, is it going to be a mesh? Is it going to be a voxel grid or something else? Also, how will the observer deal with partial observability? That is, for instance, in this simple example, color will not show up in the shadow. So the observer will have to have some mechanism for representing uncertainty about color. Also, how quickly are these representations formed? Is it a fast feed-forwards process that produces a representation in milliseconds? Or is it something that will require significant deliberation on the observer's part? And perhaps most importantly, how will the observer measure success? Remember, the observer doesn't have direct access to any kind of truth. It's just the relationship with the shadows. And so how will they know that they've represented things successfully? Now, people in the computer vision field have obviously thought about these problems for a long time. Back in 1978, Mar and Nishihara write that vision is a process that produces from images of the external world a description that is useful to the viewer and not cluttered by irrelevant information. So that description is the representation. The usefulness is the fact that we want to use those representations for downstream tasks. And this point about it not being cluttered by irrelevant information is emphasizing the point that we have to decide what we retain about the image in the representation and what we discard. And more precisely, they say that a representation is a formal system for making explicit certain entities or types of information, together with a specification of how the system does this. So it's the system and the process that produces the contents of that system. So 2 points I want to highlight even further. One is that representational form is orthogonal to information content. So you can think of a representation being a space, and then a single point of content is a point in that space. And these two things are what constitutes the representation, and we will use the word representation interchangeably here. Also, that representations are, to some extent, ultimately about abstraction. That is, to compute things that will make downstream computations and tasks more efficient. And that's why we're after representations. Now, many of you will be familiar with the supervised solution to the representation learning problem. The supervised solution first starts off by deciding which attributes that we want to care about. And this decision is made by humans. So for instance, we say that in this cave allegory, we're going to care about the class of the object for which we're seeing the image. Then we decide the format for each attribute. So for instance, we're going to say that I'm going to represent class with a string. So this first image, its class is vase. The second image, its class is ball. The third image, its class is dog, and so on. Then we're going to create a large labeled data set of image and labeled pairs. And then we're going to train a big neural network to predict the labels given images. And of course, this is a formula that you will have heard of before. It works extremely well on a diverse set of problems. Many of the tools that we now use in the real world make some form of supervised training part of their solution. However, I think it also raises several important questions. First of all, who provides the ground truth for the labels? How do we choose the person, ultimately it's a human being, that gives those labels? What if we don't know the ground truth ourselves? What if we can't find any person who would give us good labels for the task that we're interested in? Are we just stuck there, or is there something that we can still do? How do we choose which attributes we label? How do we choose which attributes we ignore for labeling? Remember, we want to learn representations that are going to be useful for downstream tasks. What if we don't know what downstream tasks we care about? How do we make these decisions in absence of knowing what we will do with those labels, with those representations later? Even once we do label, what biases do they propagate? Someone might call this a ball, someone else might call this a sphere, someone else might call it a round object. Each one of those will have an effect, effectively, on the representations that are learned. Are we doing harm by assigning labels in a particular way? And then stepping back, looking at the field from perhaps outside, do we really think that children learn purely from labels? Or are they making use of other learning schemes to come up with the representations that they have? In fact, do animals learn from labels at all? In the absence of a formal language, how do they learn that some things are dangerous, some things are tasty, some things are not dangerous, and so on? So all of this can be summarized with this last question, question 8. Can useful representations develop without labels? We can study that question as a scientific question that we might be curious about. Can useful representations develop without labels? If the answer is yes to this question, we actually have two big wins. The first, obviously, is that we can learn more efficiently when we do gain access to the labels. So this is the data efficiency argument. But the second, which is perhaps less explored, is that if we can learn representations without labels, we can still learn useful things when label collection is impossible. So consider, for instance, scenarios where objects are imperceivably small or microscopic, or situations where objects are very far away, so we can't observe them with our naked eye, or situations where the phenomena that we're studying are too complex to be processed by a human brain, like, say, the economy, for instance. In those settings, if we have effective representation learning schemes that don't need labels, then we can potentially come up with useful representations without having been limited by a human mind. But nonetheless, both 1 and 2 are really exciting prospects. I want to spend some time digging into some terminology. You'll hear people using terms like supervised and unsupervised, or labeled and unlabeled. But actually, often it's difficult to formally distinguish between these two types. For instance, supervised versus unsupervised, or labeled versus unlabeled. Consider, for instance, image captioning, where you have the task of predicting for a given image what a caption for that image might be. In the data sets that we collect, the specification of the caption, is that a label for that image, or is it merely an example of a potential caption that could make sense? In machine translation, when you have an English-French sentence pair, the specification of the pairing itself is a sort of label, right? But it's not exactly a class label that we've been talking about so far. In reinforcement learning, the specification of the reward can be seen as a label too. Perhaps it's not the same as a labeled data set, but there's a human mind behind the specification of the reward function. In generative models, as we'll see in a bit, we often have structure in the model, and that can be seen as an artifact of the human mind too. And in fact, language modeling, which is often seen very much at the unsupervised end of the spectrum, a human is choosing what data set that language model is being trained on. If you train on data set A, you'll get very different results as compared to data set B. You'll get different representations. And so, in a sense, there's a human involved in making that decision. So it's difficult to distinguish between these two ends. And instead, what I will assert is our objective is to reduce reliance on labels that can only be assigned by human brains, and instead learn more from raw measurements of the world. And so we're not trying to completely remove labels, we're just going to try to be less reliant on the kinds of information that can only be assigned by human brains, that are only the products of human brains. Still, the word unsupervised and words like unlabeled are actually rather convenient, and so you will hear us using them in our language. But what we're trying to do, as I said, is to reduce reliance on human-produced information. Now, I want to make this even further clear with an example. So imagine you want to learn representations for musical instruments that you will then use later on to either classify those instruments or predict how they will sound or describe them in a caption and so on. The supervised approach, which makes heavy use of human labels, says, I'm going to get a human being to assign a name to each one of these instruments. Say one of them is a violin, another is a viola, another is a cello, and we've got santurs and sitars and all sorts of instruments. And then I'm going to train a supervised network to predict those labels from these images, and in the process, I'll learn a representation. An alternative approach is to record videos of these instruments being played and associate those videos with the sounds that they produce, and come up with a learning scheme that learns representations to make this association. Now, this learning scheme, if it succeeds in learning these representations, will have learned these representations without a human mind assigning any labels. All we need is a video camera and a microphone, and voila, we have our representation. And to me, this is much more satisfying than the original approach, which required human names to be assigned. You know, someone might call something a violin in a different culture, it might be called completely differently. Now, supervised and unsupervised learning obviously have been around for a while, even since back in 1949 when machine learning was coined. Up until about 2006, people largely worked on methods like feature engineering and kernel methods, often with supervision. In 2006, folks started using restricted Boltzmann machines to train without labels an initialization for neural networks that would then be used for classification with labels. And of course, in 2012, we went all the way back to fully supervised training without the need for pre-training. But now there's a resurgence of interest in representation learning without labels again. So important people in our field like Hinton, LeCun, and Bengio have come out to say that they believe this is something that we should be focusing on. But I also think that it's important to emphasize that this is not an uncontroversial view. There are people who think of it as a red herring. So for instance, Rodney Brooks of Roomba fame and obviously of robotics fame had this really fascinating paper back in 1991 called Intelligence Without Representation, where he says that there is no clean division between perception and reasoning in the real world. The brittleness of current AI systems attests to this fact. So this view is that instead of thinking of representation learning as a precursor for intelligence and task competence, we should actually see it as a side effect. So first you learn to do tasks, and what you find is that you get a representation out as a side effect. I just thought it would be important to mention this viewpoint because it also exists, and it has very many proponents. Nonetheless, I think now really is a fascinating time to be studying representation learning without labels, especially because over the past year or two, we've actually seen tremendous progress in this field. I'm going to show two plots from two recent papers that show this in the realm of NLP on the left and in the realm of image processing on the right. So in both of these plots, we have on the x-axis the percentage of labeled data or the number of labeled data that we have on the downstream task that we care about. And on the y-axis, we have performance. So SQuAD is a question answering data set in NLP, and ImageNet classification is image classification in computer vision. And the two curves in each plot, one of them demonstrates performance without pre-training, without unlabeled pre-training, and the other demonstrates with unlabeled pre-training. And the same over here. So this is without unlabeled pre-training, and the blue curve is with unlabeled pre-training. And in both of these fields, we're now beginning to see representation learning without labels significantly boosting performance. So we see that, for instance, in ImageNet classification, we're making use of about 80% fewer labels in the very low data regime and about 50% fewer labels in the high data regime. And both of these kinds of results are effectively the holy grail of representation learning without labels. They have been for many years, and it's really exciting to see so much progress so quickly. So I'm going to end this first part here. In the next part, we'll talk about the building blocks that these modern methods use and